So, if you've been following me for a little while, you know that I actually started out my career in women's leadership and I worked for a premier women's leadership organization as a coach and facilitator in Silicon Valley. And when I was doing this work, I learned a lot about women's leadership, quote unquote, in particular, right? And what women needed in order to be successful, and one huge caveat is that with this group program, it was sponsored by the organizations. So a lot of the women received funding from their organization in order to attend this program. Now, I received that as a caveat because this goes into my part of behind closed doors, like kind of how I want to kick off. One of the challenges with women's leadership is that, human resources will sponsor group programs to quote unquote help women feel better, right? Now, they're not gonna say that out loud. They're gonna say, "We believe in diversifying, we believe in supporting our staff, we believe in supporting women in leadership, and so then therefore we're gonna sponsor you to attend this." Yeah, I don't know, 6 month, 3 month, I can't remember, women's leadership program. And it always felt to me like we were barely scratching the surface. Like some women would have quote unquote financial success and maybe perhaps receive a promotion opportunity or a pay raise. But in the long run, I think what we did really successfully was we helped women feel better, right? Like, so being in that collective community, women liked being around other women and they were given, some really practical tools to understand their own leadership development. But at the end of the day, I was noticing that my clients, the women that I was coaching one on one as part of this program, were pretty badass, right? They were advocating for themselves, they were speaking up, they actually felt better, right? Like they didn't need anybody to tell them that they were a great leader, but they didn't actually have the tools to make it across the finish line, like to make it to that next level. And I think one of the challenges with women's leadership programming, especially when your company sponsors it, is that you can start to feel grateful, right? And so I'm sharing this with you because very blunt and I don't want to sound like I'm knocking women's leadership across the board because I coach women. I consider myself to be part of the women's leadership field, but my personal opinion behind closed doors is that we run a risk of camaraderie and helping women commiserate with our inability to have success, right? And when you're doing that behind closed doors and you're like, I have this problem too. Oh, yes, I have this problem too. Isn't this terrible? But we don't actually have the skills and tools. And I'm not saying that the program I worked for by any means did any of this, right? But I'm just pointing this out so that you can ask yourself if you belong to these women's communities and it just sort of falls flat, like it seems like a social networking group, which is great and that definitely serves a purpose. But when you're looking at growing your career and figuring out what's next for you, sometimes you need the actual skills and tool sets to communicate at that higher executive level, to really up your game, to figure out stronger advocating and negotiation strategies so that you can actually get the title and the pay that you already deserve, right? You're a corporate badass and you're ready. One thing that I did learn when I was working for that organization was we did a lot of research on women and leadership in particular, and how women's brains work differently than men's brains. And like, I can't even remember a lot of the research. I don't think a lot about that. But what I do coach on a regular basis is sort of the emotional fuel that women feel, why women versus men often want to be in those higher level leadership positions. And from a stereotypical standpoint, it tends to be more motivated by influence and impact. It's not always motivated by title and salary, although every woman wants a higher title and salary as long as it doesn't come at the expense of their health or their family or their other priorities, right? And they've been through the ringer, right? They've seen it happen where women, whether it's themselves or their colleagues, get promoted and then all of a sudden they have no work life balance and they really regret their decisions. So there is a McKinsey Women in Leadership, Women in the Workplace report that comes out every year that McKinsey sponsors. And in this year's Women in the Workplace report, there's a strong correlation between, women not being in higher level leadership positions, but also calling it this ambition gap, that women are less ambitious. Now, 5, 10 years ago, it was actually the reason we didn't have women in leadership was because there was a pipeline problem, right? That we just don't have enough women eligible in those higher level leadership positions. I do believe that that story has changed somewhat. And now what's happening is that women are quote unquote less ambitious, right? And it's because, a lot of times women are onto you, right? We know the writing on the wall. We know if we take a higher level leadership position, then it's going to result in a different work life balance. Be careful, right? Because we as women care about more than just titles, right? We want to make an actual impact and we also want and deserve to be able to have boundaries, right? And so if there is an ambition gap, which I believe there probably is that you don't want to get yourself in those situations, those masculine roles where, which were completely created and set up so that we had no work life balance because the men wanted to be in the office all the time, right? Like they're like, I want to get away from my family. So these roles in the corporate world were created in a different time, right? And that is carried over. And as much as I would like to change that, it is part of the system. And the way that we can change it is by getting ourselves into those higher level leadership positions so that we can be the change. The other piece of this series, because we're talking about women in leadership, is I really want to point out that it is very difficult and not as much like I think in the last 5 years, but it is often feels really difficult to see women in leadership that we want to emulate, right? And when we have other people that are like us, then we can say, oh, this is possible for me as well. And so instead, what we see is we see women who got promoted to the C suite or these executive levels during a time period where they did, quote unquote, have to be more like a man, right? And that involved, working 60-hour weeks, making sure that they got everything right, that they over delivered, they had to shift their communication style. Many of these women had to shift how they dressed. They had to really be aggressive, put themselves out there, consistently advocate for themselves, consistently ask for more. And, in some instances, they were rewarded as a result of it. And then now what's happening is that, we have some of those women who are still in positions of influence and power. And I want you to ask yourself if the following is true. And I believe it's true, and I see it to be true. Is that oftentimes it's said that women have higher expectations for other women. So, meaning if you have a woman in a leadership position that's kind of like a jerk, right? You are more annoyed, more affected by, more influenced by the woman in a leadership position who's a jerk than the man in a leadership position who's a jerk. So, if you have a man in a leadership position who's a jerk, you expect it, quite frankly. I mean, you don't like it. You don't have to put up with it, but you're like, yeah, that guy is just that guy, right? And you can sort of shrug it off. You can move on. You can go get another job. You can figure out ways to deal with it. But when you have a woman in leadership that is not the kindest woman, it affects you, right? It's like, oh, she's a woman in a position of power and influence, and she's not treating her team well, right? It affects you at a different level. If you're a man, it also affects you because you'll end up getting a stereotype about women in general, right? Like, oh, all women in leadership are like that, right? That stigma can begin to carry over with you. But it's important for you to see what's actually happening, which is that, hey, I have higher expectations for women in leadership than I do for men. I expect them to use their power wisely, right? Be the institute of change that I would be if I was promoted into a higher level leadership position, right? Like they're not like the leader that I would be. And then we start to internalize it as if I got promoted, I have to be like them and I don't want to be like them. So then, therefore, I need to lower my ambitions, right? I need to lower my goals. I need to lower my standards. I need to lower my expectations, right? And I was gonna say the good news, but I mean that facetiously, is that everybody around us will jump on board with that decision, and they'll be like, "Yeah, you don't need that title. You're doing great. You're doing great just as you are." And now full circle for this episode, they're gonna remind you that you are amazing, that you are wonderful, that you are strong, that you are good just the way that you are, that you don't need titles and influence in order to be important, that you have so many wonderful things in your life. And I think that's the benefit of women's leadership and being surrounded by other kind, caring, wonderful individuals. But sometimes it's also important for us to have the actual power and influence that we deserve and to make the money and to go for the titles as long as we're doing it on our terms, as long as we remember all along the way that we are changing the face of the leadership table, that these other women in leadership that are less kind than us, are not calling the shots anymore, that we can be the change that we want to see, that we can truthfully create and carve out opportunities for ourselves that look like, quote unquote, women having it all.